tutti! Welcome to another podcast from the Italian American Museum of DC. Our programs focus on the contributions of Italian Americans to the United States in celebration of this year's 250th anniversary of our nation's independence. I'm your host, Donna De Sanctis, who's grateful for the invaluable assistance of our podcast producer, Giovanni Sciannameo, and the museum's program manager, Claudio Bonacorsi. Today, we will learn about the life and achievements of Mother Cabrini, the first American saint. Our guest is an expert on Mother Cabrini, Kristen Theriault. She is the author of When the Sickle Swings, True Stories of Catholics Who Survived Communist Oppression. And she also is the author of The Mother Cabrini Companion, which explores the saint's writings, letters, and notes. Kristen also has been featured in publications such as the National Catholic Register, The Federalist, and First Things. Very impressive. We are honored to have her as our guest here today. Welcome, Kristen.
Thank you so much, Donna. It's great to be here.
We're delighted to have you, and we're going to start with our questions. The first thing we'd like to know about Mother Cabrini is her early life. Why did she become a missionary, decide as a child to become a missionary?
Sure. So as you say, Mother Cabrini wanted to be a missionary from a very young age. She was born into a pious Catholic family in a little town called Sant'Angelo, which is near Lodi in the Lombard region, so northern Italy, near Milan. And she was born into a family that was, of course, agricultural for that time and that period, and not well off, but not destitute either. So she lived a very humble life in the beginning. She was one of 13 children, but unfortunately, only 4 of them survived past adolescence due to disease. And we will see that illness actually played a large role in Mother Cabrini's life. She was sick as a child. She had smallpox and possibly tuberculosis, which permanently weakened her heart. But she managed to live to the age of 67, which was quite impressive considering all of the adversities that she faced with her health. Now, she lived in a family that, of course, was very pious and church attending, and her uncle was actually a priest. And one of the formative experiences of her life was visiting her uncle in the neighboring town. And she would play along the riverbank, and you'll see this depicted a lot in the media surrounding the movie from several years ago, that as a child she would create these paper boats and put flowers in them and send them down the river, pretending that they were missionaries going off to preach the gospel to the whole world. So we can see from very early on that was on her heart. Her father would often read to the family from a publication called The Annals of the Propagation of the Church. So this was a periodical that detailed the missionary activity of the church, and she was very inspired by those stories. And then also she heard a visiting preacher, speak about his missions to various parts of the globe. So we can see that this was always something she was interested in. She ended up, when she took her religious vows, taking on the name of Xavier as her middle name. She was born Francesca, or her family called her Cecchina, and then she added Xaverio. So she had a great devotion to Francis Xavier, who of course was himself a great missionary saint.
So she clearly found her bliss when she was really a child.
Yes, and actually, one of these times she actually had a near-death experience when she was playing on the river, and that, I think, cemented this for her. She was playing with these boats, and she fell in and almost drowned, and she found herself on the bank and didn't know how she got there. So both she and her uncle assumed it was her guardian angel who physically intervened to save her. So she found it, and then we could tell God really wanted this for her life as well.
She focused, once she became a missionary or a nun, she focused on helping Italian immigrants in the United States. Why did that become her focus?
So this is one of those examples of how God's will for Mother Cabrini was really something she never would have picked or known to pick for herself. So she always had a heart for Asia. She wanted to go specifically to China to be a missionary there. And once she took her vows and built up her convent and then eventually approached the Pope to gain missionary status, she pitched this idea to him. She really wanted to go to the East, and that was her passion. But this was Pope Leo the 13th. He famously told her, "My daughter, not to the east, but to the west." And he specifically had New York City picked out for her. And this was for several reasons. He had been receiving a lot of missives from his priests and bishops in the US that were basically telling him of the dire circumstances there, especially for the Italian immigrants, not only physical poverty that they were living in and discrimination from the government and from society, but also the moral degradation of the community. That unfortunately, the priests that were there were very overwhelmed, and because of the poverty and the desperation, people were falling into all sorts of crime. And in the 2024 movie, you'll see a character who I believe is fictional. I couldn't find any evidence of this, but it's a young woman who had turned to prostitution due to desperation in just the slums that the immigrants were forced to live in New York. And so Mother Cabrini's mission was not only to bring physical help to alleviate their physical suffering, but to reconvert these Italian diaspora who were living so far from the quite Italian country, or the quite, excuse me, Catholic country that they came from. America at that point was anti-Catholic in general. We saw the discrimination against the Irish several generations earlier. It was a very Protestant country among the leadership. And so Italian immigrants were not only discriminated against because of their ethnicity, but also because of their religion. And due to that reason, their practice of the sacraments had really started to wane. And they weren't getting much help from the Italian government because at that point it was the age of secularism and liberalism with Garibaldi and the unification of Italy. And so it was really left to the clergy to take on this role. And Leo the 13th saw this great need and saw Mother Cabrini's great heart for converting people. And she really had to reevaluate what her vocation was, and that it was not a conversion of people for the first time from other religions, but rather a reconversion of Catholics whose families had been Catholics for centuries.
That's really an amazing twist to her life from east to west.
Mhm.
What time period are we talking about? When did she come to New York, and how did she overcome the many obstacles that you've already described and more?
hmm So she was born in 1850, and so she spent really the first 30 years of her life in Italy, and then her mission started in her late 30s, 40s, and beyond. So she was traveling back and forth to the US, specifically to New York, in about the turn of the century. So this is right around the time of the Ellis Island wave beginning, a great time for immigrants of many nations, and she was part of that wave. She actually had booked passage on the Titanic for one of her voyages, but luckily, through the grace of God, she rebooked because she wanted to be in Chicago earlier to tend to her mission there. So she missed that. Another
Another
one of those.
miracle.
Yeah, exactly. And so this time, of course, was the time where America was bringing in many immigrants. And interestingly, I'm not Italian at all, but my grandparents both told me when I was writing this book that each of their mothers had a deep devotion to Mother Cabrini. They were German and Irish, respectively, and I think it's because they related so much to that immigrant experience from this time period. And Mother Cabrini was an example to all Americans, really, who were rethinking what it meant to be an American and reshaping what we know as America from the 20th century on. So she arrived in New York, and right from the get-go, she had to deal with a lot of bureaucracy. Within the church, she met the priest there, Father Morelli, who was quite overwhelmed by just the amount of work that he had to do. And the house that she was told was going to be ready for her and her sisters was, in fact, not ready. So they had to, pivot right at the beginning and find somewhere else to live. And then it was just problem after problem. So she dealt with the highest echelons of bureaucracy of New York society, getting permits, getting permission to build, to open orphanages. She really build this trifecta wherever she went of her missions, which included orphanages, schools, and hospitals to minister to all really of the corporal works of mercy within that trifecta. And then, of course, the schools developed the spiritual works as well. And one case that particularly sticks out is actually a case of arson towards one of her hospitals in New York City, where someone, where I don't know if they ever caught the person, really objected to her building in this neighborhood because of the anti-Italian sentiment. And they set fire to the hospital. And she, I think, I'm not sure if it burnt to the ground, but she did manage to still open it, either there or in another location. And just at every turn, she was dealing with these very complicated legal questions of where she could build, etc. And this is someone who, before she took her great voyage to New York, had rarely left Lombardy. She famously, her family had inherited something from a relative and they had to travel to Rome to receive it. And they got on the road and decided, no, it's not worth it. We don't want to leave our home. So they turned around and went back. And so this level of travel and really what it took to live out her vocation was something that was foreign to her nature, but she knew she had to do it anyway. And she was really indefatigable in making sure all the T's were crossed and I's were dotted in order to get her missions the legal status they needed and able to minister to the people.
That's amazing, Kristen, because she probably was born in a very, very small rural town,
Mhm.
and that's all she knew. And then she comes to one of the biggest cities in the world, this teeming metropolis, and somehow she manages her way through the bureaucracy. I'm also curious to know, how does she find the funds to build these schools and hospitals?
hmm So she actually would ask for alms from the Italian immigrant community. And this was really touching to read about because she would come into contact with people who had fallen away from the faith and maybe hadn't been to church in years, but they would be very touched by her affect. She just had this charming personality in addition to her spiritual goodness that really attracted people. So she, at the beginning, would gain funds just for her and her sisters to live. And then from there, she would approach greater and more wealthy donors in order to build these greater projects. And there, she was limited because, of course, the bureaucracy would try to limit who she could receive funds from and, taxes and where these would have to go. And so she had to be really creative with her fundraising. And this is where actually a lot of stories of miracles of her life occur, which I was really surprised to read about. But for example, she, in the early days, was asking for provisions from the local immigrant community, and a wine merchant had agreed to give her a certain amount of wine. And her sisters insisted that there was no money to pay him, and they just literally did not have any. And she said, check again. And they opened their pocket, and there was the money to pay this merchant. And little stories like this occurred again and again, where you can see God was providing for her daily needs. But Mother Cabrini, in her great humility, would always downplay these stories and say, no, don't tell anyone, which, mimics what Jesus did with his own miracles, is not, of course, always having that spirit of humility in her.
Yeah, this her missionary work in New York and then Chicago kind of dovetails with the Gilded Age here. Did she get any kind of help from people like the Vanderbilts or the Astors in her mission?
I don't believe she did from any of those big names. I could be wrong, but I think because of the dovetailing of the anti-Catholic and anti-Italian sentiment, these bigger sort of WASP names didn't get involved. But I do recall a few stories of her really winning the hearts of these type of Anglo Protestants, especially on her journeys back and forth. So one of the sources that I looked at for my book was her travel writings, where she would write home to her sisters about the daily goings on and her transatlantic voyages. And in one of them, she makes friends with a very wealthy and prominent Protestant woman who, despite the chasm socioeconomically between them, was interested in Mother Cabrini's work. And I think at the end of the voyage, this woman made a gift of a small statue of the Blessed Virgin to Mother Cabrini and promised that she would visit the Mother House in Rome. And it was either her or someone else who ended up converting. So I think it's possible that they did also provide some financial support after such um, a good experience with Mother Cabrini, but I would have to double check on the exact financials of that.
Um, she clearly has leadership qualities
Mhm.
to everything that you've described. Was there any particular quality of hers that struck you as being particularly helpful?
Definitely. And I think it would come down to humility because she treated everyone the same, regardless of their background. So, like with this example of the Protestant woman, she approached her with the same spirit that she would the poor immigrant. So she really did not see socioeconomic status or wealth or anything. She only saw the soul. And she famously, as I write in the introduction, she said that she had heaven in her heart. So she really just was behaving as if she were already in heaven and these were children of God. And I think that really appealed to people because it didn't matter what your background was. And ultimately, while she had such a heart for the poor, her goal was to save souls. So she wanted to alleviate as much human suffering as she could and be a humanitarian in that way. But ultimately, she wanted to bring these people closer to God. And so she could see that, like the rich man in the Gospels, like sometimes the wealthy were the ones in need of the most spiritual care, or vice versa. So that was, I think, shocking to a lot of people who were used to operating within strict social boundaries based on class, especially during that time. And actually, on a lot of her voyages, she would book the cheapest possible ticket in what was called steerage or third class. And the captain would say, "No, we know this." They recognized her names, and they would actually upgrade her and her sisters to first class and insist that she would come and dine with them. And she just had this effect on people where they couldn't believe what she was doing. She said to Pope Leo the 13th, "The world is too small for what I want to do," which is where the title for her biography comes from. And I think people were impressed not only with the scale of her work, but also her work ethic and how joyful she was in it. And that led people to her. And then to lead her own sisters as well, because in addition to all of this humanitarian work she was doing, she was the mother of a convent, so she had to form their spiritual life as well. And she took lots of retreats and wrote to them of what she learned on those. And there's this really nice incident where on one of her voyages, one of her sisters fell asleep on her shoulder and woke up and was really embarrassed and said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And Mother Cabrini said, "What better place to take rest than with your mother?" So she was just very approachable and anyone could talk to her.
You know, Kristen, it occurs to me, where does she learn enough English to work her way through the bureaucracy?
Yeah, it was a challenge for her. I recall some letters of her working on it with her sisters on the voyages over, and I think I'm not sure if it came easily to her or not, but she managed to learn it within her work. Probably a lot of on the job training, as we would think of, especially arriving. Of course, she was living within Italian immigrant communities, but right away she was dealing with bishops who were of Irish descent, and so she needed it right away. So I'm sure it was a work in progress her life long, but she really dedicated herself to it.
Yeah, she had to deal with the bureaucrats in the city as well.
Yep,
And a complete different set of vocabulary when you're dealing with bureaucracy. That's
of
quite
course.
really amazing. Um, why was she canonized by the Catholic Church?
So her canonization was pretty quick after her death, actually. She died in 1917, and then she was canonized within 30 years by 1946 and beatified in 1938. So a couple things needed for canonization, of course, popular devotion. So as I've talked about, even non-Italian Americans had great devotion to her. And of course, the fruits of her labors were everywhere within this country. She went famously to New York and Chicago, also to Louisiana, California at the end of her life, and Colorado, where she actually set up a mission for the logging communities who were completely stripped away from all civilization at that point and had no access to the sacraments. So she went really everywhere in this country, and people knew her by her works. And so the popular cult, as it's called, toward a saint is something that the Vatican looks at for canonization, and that was alive and healthy. And then, of course, you need several miracles. And one miracle that stands out is a baby was born in Chicago, and a nurse. So it's typical to administer some eye ointments to babies after birth, and the nurse put, I guess, the wrong ointment. It was 50% silver, some sort of compound, and it was the wrong thing. And the baby went blind, and the doctor said that his corneas were completely destroyed and he would be blind his whole life. One of the sisters touched a relic of Mother Cabrini to his eyes, and suddenly he could see. So that was accepted by the Vatican as one of the miracles. And um, of course, she needed several others, and she was really fast tracked and canonized by the 1940s. So
Amazing. And she became a naturalized American citizen because she's the first American saint.
that's
What
right.
what made her decide to do that? To
Well,
become
it seems that she really did come to view herself as an American. She, like many immigrants of that time, was eager to embrace this country and, in her case, to convert it and to bring it to Christ. And she had a special love for, I think, the entrepreneurial and pioneering spirit because she could really relate to that as someone who was quite ambitious herself. She saw that as one of the really good, unique qualities of Americans. And she made her life here. So she did go on missions to other countries as well. By the end of her life, she had founded 67 mission houses across many continents. She went to Europe, South America, Central America, but really the United States, especially New York and Chicago, were her home. And she ended up dying in Chicago a few days before Christmas of 1917. So she really adopted this country as her own, just like the immigrant communities that she served.
um, are the institutes, the orphanages, the hospitals, the schools that she founded, are any of them still in existence today?
They are, yes. Her sisters continue their work. So the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart, and they actually, ironically, did eventually make it to China after Mother Cabrini's death, which was her original goal. So I believe that was in the 1920s. And they continue her charism today. They're still working, especially with their humanitarian goals. And I know sort of indirectly, she inspired Mother Teresa, actually. She kept a picture of Mother Cabrini on her desk and really saw her as a mentor and a patron of her humanitarian work. And we can see the huge legacy that she has wrought. So she continues to inspire to this day.
That's um, that's very touching
Hmm.
that she inspired another person, a saintly
I
person,
know.
to work with
I
them.
know. Between the two of them, they covered the whole globe.
Um, can you can you see her approach to helping the immigrants be of any help to us today with our immigration situation?
I think the main thing of Mother Cabrini's approach was she saw human dignity in everyone. And that's because, as we talked about, she was seeing them for their soul. She wanted to save their soul. She saw them really as God sees them. And she did not discriminate in any way, shape, or form, but she just saw that everyone deserved, especially spiritual care, but also these corporal works of mercy. So she's definitely a great person whose work we can refer to for modern crises in that area. Another thing about her is that, sort of as I alluded to, she really respected the rule of law. So she made sure to get every single form filled out that she had to for each of these. So I think in today's conversation, that nuanced approach that she had really gives us sort of a middle ground from which to approach these issues.
Yeah, certainly the humanitarian aspect of it, mercy.
Mhm.
Um, Tell us a little bit about the book, your book,
Sure.
your study of Mother Cabrini. Anything
Yes.
strike you that you didn't know before?
Yes, so this actually really introduced Mother Cabrini to me. I had known who she was, but I think before I researched her, I somehow sometimes got her confused with Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, or she was just sort of I was dimly aware of her. But when I undertook this book, and this is actually really written as a companion to the movie that came out in 2024, it really opened the world of Mother Cabrini to me. So my book is called The Mother Cabrini Companion. And this is actually a selection of quotes by Mother Cabrini herself. So she wrote extensively during her life, and the main sources that I used are her travel writings, as I mentioned. She wrote back to her sisters to encourage them when she was away on missions but couldn't be there to tend to their daily needs. And then also her retreat notes when she would take retreats for herself, for her own development. And so these are all Mother Cabrini's own words. I wrote the introduction, and I also tried to organize them thematically. So it's set up as a devotional where there are a year's worth of weeks that you can work your way through. So it's a book that you don't really have to read all in one sitting. You can take it with you to Mass or to adoration and read it at your own pace. And they're split up thematically. So I have, for example, the missionary of the Sacred Heart, imitation of Christ, the missionary and the gift of faith, humility, serenity, and all of these topics that Mother Cabrini really expounded on during her life. So, one thing that I say in the introduction that stood out to me was that she was always at peace, but never at rest. And that was something that was a nuance that I really had to think about because she was extremely busy her whole life long. She was always filling out paperwork and going places and working on very, practical worldly projects. But at the same time, she had this peace about her because she was doing these projects for the kingdom of God. And she knew she would give these really impossible knots and problems to God, and he would somehow find a way, like with the miracle with the wine and with being able to find buildings in all of these cities. So she worked very hard and she was very busy, but she was not really characterized by the anxiety that we associate busyness with. And I think especially today where everyone is so busy and technology makes that even more immediate, that's a really great spirit to try to carry forward and take from Mother Cabrini because she even today, I mean, think of what she could do with technology. I'm sure she wouldn't let it get to her and really overwhelm her. And so that she really struck a great balance in that way. The other book that is relevant here is actually the biography of her, which was also published at the same time as mine by Theodore Maynard. The World is Too Small. And this one comes actually with a foreword from Cardinal Dolan, who, of course, has a great heart for New York and immigrant history of New York. So, between the two of those, you'll get a lot of her spiritual insights and then the biographical details of her life.
I that quote, always at peace but never at rest.
Mhm.
Wonderful capsular encapsulates.
Yes, thank you.
I was interested that this film on Cabrini came out what about 2 years ago.
Yep.
How did that come about? Do you have any idea why she was chosen?
So I know this was in the works for a long time with Angel Studios and some of their patrons and donors, and I'm not sure exactly why Mother Cabrini was chosen, but this was something that this is the same film studio that produces The Chosen, for example. So they, of course, are always bringing religious stories and stories of the gospel to light, and someone must have had a devotion to Mother Cabrini because they went through many years of preparation before this came to fruition. And it, of course, is very timely for our current era. So I think it just was the right time. And I think for a lot of people, it introduced Mother Cabrini for the first time. And the movie is really striking. I don't know if have you seen it? Yeah. And I think one thing it really brings home is the poverty of the time period because you can read about that, but not really fully understand it. So, several scenes where she goes into the sewers to rescue children, and it's just this abject poverty with rats and disease, and really brings home what she was alleviating. Because another thing that really defined her work was the fact that she wanted to provide for the spiritual care of these people, but first she had to lift them out of this just survival mode so that they could focus on their spiritual life. So that I think the visuals of the movie really make that clear in a way that reading about it doesn't.
Yes, you're right. It was really powerful, very
Hmm.
and beautifully filmed too.
Absolutely.
Kristen, I don't know how to thank you. I'm from the museum, on the part of the museum, for this wonderful, wonderful exposition on Mother Cabrini. We've learned so much more about her, thanks to you.
Of
Thank you
course.
so
Well,
much.
thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
You're very welcome. And thank you all for joining us on the podcast of the Italian American Museum of DC. Thank you.